Welcome to Caritas Quaerens. In this series, we're taking a look at the topic of free will, and more specifically at some of the arguments that are adduced against apokatastasis, or Christian universalism, from a free will perspective. In this video, I'd like to take a look at one of the arguments against free will, against apokatastasis, which basically says that ultimately, even if we damn ourselves, even if we make decisions that ultimately end up driving us to endless hell, that God does not cease to love us, and he does not cease to want us to be saved, but he basically has tied his own hands, and he has agreed not to do anything to stop us. He has agreed not to intervene or override our free will, and he, as much as he wants to see us happy and have us in union with him, for some reason, he prefers to keep us damned. He prefers to keep us damned and yet free. Now, I find that very troubling, especially when we look at it in analogy to human acts. Now, some would say, well, you can't compare God to human beings because God is ultimately above us and his ways are not our ways, and so on. It's like comparing apples to oranges. Okay, but that only goes so far. Okay, certainly God is far above us, is infinitely greater than we are. And therefore, there is a sense in which really we can only ever speak about God by analogy, or in a sense by means of symbols and signs, whether they're words or actual symbols like in a sacramental system or whatever. Okay, I got that. That's fine. However, there's a difference between seeing God as infinitely above us and saying that the most we can say about God only approaches what he's actually like. And there's another thing to say that God's ways might be totally contradictory to our ways. That passage that I just mentioned, that God's ways are high above our ways, if you read it in context, I don't think it's saying that God's ways are totally contradictory to our ways. That, in other words, what God calls good is the complete opposite of what, in human morality seems to be good. There may be some people who would call what God calls good evil, but it's because they've got it wrong. I would say that what we call good, by general consensus, in the law, for instance, and in general human morality and natural law, what we call good maybe only approaches the goodness of God, but at the same time, it's in line with God's goodness. It's not contradictory to it. So when we consider something to be good in human experience, in human morality, at least as a universal principle, okay, as a general principle, it should not contradict what is good for God, in a sense, or what is in harmony with God's nature, with who God is. Okay, so let me give you an example. If one of my children tells me, tomorrow at 3:00 in the afternoon, I'm going to go over to the cliff at the edge of town and I'm going to throw myself off and kill myself. Okay, am I bound to respect his free will? Am I limited to only trying to coerce him or persuade him not to do it? Of course not. In fact, I would feel myself absolutely 100% obligated to stop him with whatever means I could, even if it implies using force. I would not find it at all repugnant to free will or to his dignity as a person to grab him and to tie him down if necessary to keep him from throwing himself off of a cliff. And moreover, I think that any parent worth his salt, any parent who has even the slightest bit of common sense and love for their children would agree with me. And yet the free will model seems to presume that God has no problem whatsoever with allowing many or possibly even most of his children to do just that, to commit spiritual suicide for all eternity, to basically choose a destiny that is endless death. What kind of father does that? I mean, the reality is that if a human being can stop some evil and chooses not to do so, then really that person is complicit in the evil that is being done. So if I could stop my son from throwing himself off and I choose not to, then I'm partly responsible. I'm complicit with his act. I become an accessory to his act by basically permitting it, by basically, approving of it, at least indirectly. So I don't see how God doesn't become complicit, in a sense, with the damnation of those who, according to the free will model, who damn themselves by permitting them to do so. If God says, "Okay, well, I created you with free will, so if you choose to damn yourself, I'm not going to stop you, even though I could, even if it meant that I had to take your free will away." So God would seem to be complicit there with that act. Now, there's a couple other follow-ups to this. One is that some will make the argument and say, yes, but sometimes for the sake of a greater common good or some other greater good, a person might be permitted to allow somebody to do something evil like that. Okay, so for instance, if I don't know, if my son were to say, "Listen, Dad, I'm either going to, I'm either going to throw myself off the cliff, or if I don't, then I don't know how this would work out, but I'm just coming up with some kind of outlandish situation." Okay, if I don't throw myself off the cliff, then I know that 5,000 people over in Africa are going to die because I don't know, because I have some kind of rare disease that's going to spread and they're going to catch it or something. I don't know, whatever. Okay, okay. And so somebody might say, in that case, I'd be justified in allowing my son to kill himself because ultimately it would be saving the many other lives, right? Okay. Well, I would still push back against that and say, I don't know. I'm not sure that I buy that. I'm not sure that we couldn't envision a situation in which one could not neutralize the danger. In other words, if my son really is posing some real threat to 5,000 people in Africa, isn't there some other third way, some other alternative that would keep him alive and yet at the same time keep him from spreading this disease to the people in Africa? Maybe we need to think a little more creatively here, okay? And I would ask the same question in regards to God and eschatology. If the free will model says that God ultimately respects our freedom and allows people to commit suicide because of a greater good, and that greater good, they would often say, is the actual nature of free will itself. The alternative, they would say, is if God intervenes or overrides their free will or deprives them of their free will, even if just for a moment, that he is really taking away what is essential to their human nature. In other words, he's basically debasing them and making them less than human. And it's a greater good for them to have their freedom, even if they use it to commit spiritual and eternal suicide, than for God to deprive them of that free will, even if it's only momentarily, even if it's only in one decision, okay? But again, I don't really buy that. I would say, really? Like, isn't there some third alternative? I mean, let's be creative here. God is omnipotent, which means he can do anything. God is all-knowing. God is all-wise, all good. I mean, you name it, he's got every perfection, right? He's the supreme being, okay? Plus, he's a loving father. He is love. Don't you think God can figure out a way to save these souls without depriving them of their freedom? Or even if he needs to deprive them of their freedom, don't you think that there's some way that he can still bring a greater good out of it, even if they have to sacrifice their freedom momentarily? I mean, here I would also interject the thought that I have about the nature of free will. And if you didn't see the first video in this series about what is free will, I'd encourage you to go back and watch it, because my idea too is that it's not so much that free will is just the power to choose either of two alternatives without any restrictions, regardless of the circumstances. Free will is ordered towards something good. So, ultimately, if a person is using their free will to do something bad, I don't see that it's really necessarily depriving them of something that's totally eminently good, even if it's just momentarily. On the contrary, I think that if their free will is ordered towards something good and they're misusing it, then a person would have every right, in fact, every responsibility to deprive them of their freedom, at least momentarily, until they are ready to use their freedom or exercise their freedom in accordance with the good, which is ultimately their development as persons and their full union with God. So I don't really buy that argument either, that it's okay for God to permit people to damn themselves, in order to uphold freedom. That freedom, that goes back to another video I made where basically I think the underlying premise here is that freedom is so good, is so important, that it really outweighs every other consideration. And I don't believe that's true. So, and if somebody does, and you want to argue with me, go ahead. I'd love to argue it out. I'd love to try to figure this out and understand it more. But I haven't seen any argument that really shows me that free will is the ultimate good or the ultimate capacity that humans have that we can't live without. That is the sine qua non of being a human being and attaining perfection. I just don't see it. Okay, so that's one of the arguments. Again, is that ultimately God can permit us to commit spiritual suicide because for a greater good. In other words, to maintain our freedom. Okay, but let's just stop for a minute and say, what if we don't look at this from an infernalist perspective? So what if it's not a matter of some people ultimately will go to hell and never enjoy full union with God, but what if apokatastasis is true? And what if all people ultimately will enjoy full union with God, if God will find a way to save all? Then it no longer becomes a problem, okay? Because ultimately then, it's not really an issue if God has to intervene sometimes, if God has to deprive a person or bind a person's free will, at least momentarily, or even for an extended period of time, if it's for their good. Because ultimately, even depriving them of their free will for a time may actually benefit them in the long run. And in fact, it might actually make them capable in the long run of maturing to the point and developing to the point where they can use their free will properly. So if my son wants to commit suicide by jumping off the cliff, I might need to stop him. Not because I'm going to tie him down and keep him tied down for the rest of his life, but to save him in that moment when he's about to make a tremendously egregious, poor choice, bad use of his free will. And so then, why I'm not binding his free will permanently. I'm binding his free will so that he has the chance to learn how to use it more appropriately. And then he can go on and he can understand the importance of life and the importance of his life more. And maybe we can talk and figure out what led him to this. And maybe there's depression or anxiety or whatever, But what I'm saying is in the long run, this binding of his free will is ultimately not a once and done thing. It's ultimately not a forever thing. It's ultimately only done with the purpose of restoring him to greater use of his free will in the long run, with enabling him to better mature and develop so that he's able to exercise his free will more appropriately and in conjunction with how he is supposed to use it as a human being. Okay? A person sometimes has to be bound down. If somebody is sick, they might need to be quarantined for a time period. If you've been alive for the last couple of years, you know what that's like, right? But it's not meant to be forever, and it's not meant to be something that restricts them for good or permanently. It's meant to be only for a time, for their good and others, and ultimately, hopefully, it will enable them in the long run to grow and to enjoy greater freedom. Imagine if I were sick and I weren't quarantined and nobody were taking care of me. First of all, I might damage other people, and I might actually weaken myself and grow so sick that I become debilitated and enjoy less freedom in the long run. So yes, I might need to have my freedom restricted, even against my will, in order to help me in the long run to enjoy greater use of that freedom. So anyway, if you have found this helpful or interesting at all, I'd appreciate if you would like and subscribe, share this with others you think might benefit from it or might enjoy it. And as always, please, I love to hear comments from you. I've had some comments in the past where they've actually really made me think about things and have prompted some of my other videos. So I love to hear comments, even if it's negative things, even if it's things you think I need to improve, go for it, okay? And I'd love to hear your thoughts too, and some of your insights about this, because I certainly don't know everything. and I'm pretty confident, actually, that one of the things I can say with pretty good certitude is that most of what I say is probably not very reliable. I'm just thinking about these things and pondering them out loud, basically, and I would love to dialogue. So if you have any comments, please put them in the box below. Until next time, thanks for watching. Adios.